There's so many of these strategies to survive the constant influx in unreliable others. And when we find ourselves caught in these patterns, we don't have choice.
Welcome to Season 2 of Leadership Impact, the podcast for modern executives who are reinventing leadership within their organizations. With your host, Executive Leadership Coach and CEO of the Granger Network, Kari Granger, and me, Paul Adams, CEO of Sound Financial Group. This season focuses on accountability. And to support you in increasing accountability in yourself and in those you lead, we're providing a special rate for our listeners who want to engage in one of our accountability courses. Text the word accountability to 555-888 for more information. This is episode 24. Get to know your default escape strategies.
Welcome back to Leadership Impact. Today, we're going to talk about getting to know your default escape strategy. So when we have today so much coming at us, the constant influx of all of it, emails, taskers, picking kids up, making dinner, taking care of ourselves, the next project, the prospect, just everything, monitoring our financial well-being, going to the gym, not going to the gym, dealing with the fact you're not going to the gym, just the constant influx, all the social media that comes at us that we feel like we need to monitor and reply to, and the text messages, and, just all the time, the constant influx. And that we definitely need to survive and figure out how to escape the domination of all that. And then also, we have to survive unreliable others. The people that we rely on that don't come through. So here's what I've learned, Paul, is to deal with the constant inbound and to deal with unreliable others. Most of us have come up with a default escape strategy, or you could say a default survival pattern. It's almost like a habitual pattern that we go into, and it's just to survive this influx and unreliable others.
Well, and would that be like one thing I think about when other people are unreliable, like somebody misses a meeting? In the past, actually, frankly, prior to being in some of these conversations with you and recording the podcast, my default would be internally for me was some version of, I do not miss meetings like that. How come these other people don't have their stuff together? And it was like a moral superiority, maybe.
Yeah, well, that's a part of it. So every strategy has three components. They have an assessment, they have a mood, and they have a pattern, like what you do. So the assessment of, I would never do it. Those people are unreliable. Or what did you say? That was kind of your assessment. What did you say about it?
Yeah, some version of they're not reliable. Can't they keep their stuff together? They've got to cancel a meeting, but they tell me the morning of rather than a week ago.
So a lot of people will have this assessment like, no one is reliable around here. I'll have to do it myself.
Yes.
And that goes, and I can just hear in the way you're saying there's a mood of righteousness or justified.
Yes.
So a mood, you've got like this interpretation or assessment. If you didn't hear season 1, assessment might sound kind of funny to you. It's like an interpretation or a conclusion that you've come to about yourself, others, or life, right? So you got like an interpretation or an assessment. Okay, then you have a mood that goes with it. That those are both part of this survival strategy, this escape strategy. And then you have what you do. So when you have that assessment that they're not reliable and you have this mood of righteousness or justified, what do you then do? What do you do to survive that situation?
Oftentimes, if people miss more than a few meetings with me, I just want to be done with them. And that goes for our personal lives too with my wife and I, that it's like there's so much coming in on us. And if we have friends that are unreliable at being able to keep the plans we made 2 months ago and they let themselves get derailed a few days out, it's like we don't have a lot of space for that. And so we normally will do it by just the pattern would be distance.
Distancing. Yeah, that's what you do. Just provide distance. Don't respond, stop making plans with them. Yeah, so distancing.
Mm-hmm.
And at work, if no one's reliable around here and I have to do it myself, then we just do it ourselves. We make others wrong. We invalidate them. We even create situations unconsciously where we're the hero. We avoid collaboration. We avoid delegation. These are just some of the ways in which we deal with people not being reliable. We complain. So then the default escape strategy is an assessment, they're not reliable, a mood of righteousness, and a pattern of doing it myself, being the hero, invalidating others, and complaining. And it's like, that's the pattern. That's the habit.
Seen me do it.
Yeah, right.
What's another example? My wife jokes, people have a fight or flight mechanism,
Mm-hmm.
and they're like, you were born without the flight mechanism. You just tend to want to tilt right in. What would be an example of somebody that doesn't have that tilting into conflict gene that they might, what's a pattern one of our listeners might be bumping into right now that would take them down the assessment mood pattern that wouldn't be the one that's like everybody's else is a jerk, but the one where they go deeper into themselves, like self-reflective in a way that's ineffective.
Oh, ineffective? Yeah. So this sometimes happens with people who believe that, they're a good person, good people get it done, they're not getting it done, there's all these expectations of them. So they get in a mood of overwhelm or anxiety or guilt.
Guilt, yes.
Right? And so then how do you deal with the guilt? Well, you overwork. You don't take time for yourself. You just keep adding more hours on evenings and weekends. You avoid declining projects, stay up late, wake up early, find shortcuts, apologize. And eventually, sometimes you just give up in resignation.
Oh, yeah. And I've watched entrepreneur, business owner clients of ours that love their people so much that they go through that assessment mood pattern to deal, like you just said, to deal with all the inbound, and they're really trying to take care of everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, maybe not taking good care of themselves or spending enough time with their own family.
Yeah. Or the person who's, gosh, there's so much stuff and people, they're unreliable, but there's like expectations of me and I don't know what's going on. So like almost the confused person, right? Or maybe the resentful person, the one, they don't have a clue how much I'm doing. Like all this stuff I'm doing and no one else around here is reliable. They don't have a clue how much I'm doing. And it's unreasonable to ask this much of a person. Well, what's my mood? Resentful? Maybe resigned and hopeless. I said it in a way that was resentful. So then what's my pattern? Well, I gossip. I tell others how bad it is. I withdraw. I passively resist. I act with resentment. I might even, some of us in that pattern can procrastinate a bit.
I've even watched folks go through that pattern you just mentioned, where they don't even gossip in the office. Great integrity there, but they go home.
Oh, their spouses
and tell
hate
their
you.
spouse
Yes.
everything. And the trouble is that what they do is they actually, like, even if the workplace improves, they've now created a home life that's impossible for them to now get successful where they are because they soured the experience of the spouse so much on the personal front that they literally, even if that employer offered them great opportunity in the future, they could never pursue it with that employer.
Right. I've seen me do that, where the only place I complain is at home. And then all of a sudden things shift and I try to enroll, my family and in this next thing. And he's like, why? They're jerks. Like, that doesn't even make sense. I mean, this been a while ago, so don't worry if you're related to me at this point. But I do remember doing that and learning from that,
Yes.
like don't only say the negative things. So, okay, I'm going to give you one more that I've seen a lot of.
I'm ready.
I didn't do something, right? And the assessment is if they find out I didn't do what I promised, I'll be in trouble. That's the assessment. Okay, so there's all this stuff. I didn't do what I promised. I'll be in trouble. The mood is fearful. And the pattern is we hide out. We avoid the topic or the persons who's counting on us. We also, eventually, if we do that enough, if we do get confronted, we'll provide justifications, excuses, explanations, instead of really accounting for our word. We'll provide all of that. We'll numb ourselves to the impact that not accounting for our word has on the results we're trying to produce. So, there's so many of these strategies to survive the constant influx in unreliable others. And when we find ourselves caught in these patterns, we don't have choice. It's like we got one way to be, and especially today, as the pace seems to really be increasing, I found a lot of people in overwhelm and a lot of people feeling like, man, good people get it done and I should get it done. And as such, you just work more hours. They delete the time for themselves. They don't, by the way, decline projects. They stay up late and then they're just always apologizing. I don't know, when you find yourself in these patterns, the first step to get out of it is to just be aware. This is your pattern. What is your, there's a million of these. We just gave a couple examples, so what's your go-to assessment? What's the mood that you get into with that assessment? Because, assessments and moods, they always go together, right? Mm-hmm. And then given that, what's the thing you always do, right? So for me, I really do go, nobody can do it but me, right? So I have to do it all myself. And I get righteous, I get resentful about it. I make others wrong, and then I got to work all night and all morning, and then I get mad about it. So that's my pattern. And if I can notice that, oh my God, I'm doing that pattern, I'm doing my default escape strategy, I can start to have choice other than that. So the first thing's awareness. Then the next thing I think would be to look for, well, what am I really committed to? And let me create, let me get in collaboration with others and create a adult way out, create a productive strategy out of this. Let me get in a mood of curiosity, maybe a mood of responsibility, and create a new pathway out.
So you go into I just want to make sure I captured this right, that we notice our assessment mood pattern of our default escape strategy, that survival pattern, when because it feels like anytime we're faced with something where we feel like we were wrong, that the deep part of our nervous system is like, I have managed to live this long, this many decades of life, and haven't died doing it this way.
Keep doing it if you want it.
And somebody says different, like the doing nearly anything different is going to trigger that survival mechanism. And so to pause that survival mechanism by being aware of what it was my assessment, what's going on between my ears right now, what's the mood, and what's the pattern that I'm about to play out, and instead revisit it with awareness, revisit the commitment, what's the outcome we want, for the sake of what, in a mood of curiosity, and then you mentioned involving the other stakeholders. You use that word, but that's what I'm
be in communication, even being aware. So one of the things you said is, in Granger, I've been doing this for so long, right? Well, one of the things that's useful is identify your assessment, the mood, what you do, but then ask yourself the question, what am I getting out of this? And then what is it costing me? So that I can actually get that, wow, I'm keeping this around because there's a payoff. There's a benefit from keeping this around. I get to be the hero. I get to be the righteous, justified one, which is a Benny we never like to talk about, but we kind of like to be in.
Yep.
But what's it costing me? And by the way, I can avoid being responsible for actually producing an awesome outcome in my life. I can avoid being responsible for my life going well, my job going well. I make it somebody else's responsibility. Those are all kind of bennies, and they're hidden bennies, but sometimes we do things for these kinds of payoffs. We keep it around.
There was a gentleman that worked for me many years ago who had, and I didn't have all these distinctions quite put together this way, but walked him through. I said, I've noticed this each time this happens, that there's breakdowns, and it's almost because you didn't think through all your actions ahead of time, but then you manage to pull a rabbit out of a hat every time and save the day. But But if you just flip the pages in the book back 2 weeks prior, you were the hero, but you were also the villain that set up all the events you now had to deal with.
Right.
And you should have seen like oh my word. And I said, the thing that you would have to take on, which he never did fully take on, but I hope our listeners can hear this. And for those that may be afflicted the same way, could take something away. If you give up being the villain, you might not have as many situations in which you get to look like the hero.
Yeah, totally. And we don't even see that. Like, oh, no way, I don't care about that. But watch it. Watch the little dopamine hit that you get when you're the hero. It's a righteous one, but, now what we often don't see is the huge cost it has on our well-being. It has on our performance. It has on our relationships. When I get the way I get in my pattern, it just really invalidates people, and it impacts our relationships in a big way. And it impacts what we can do together, because I basically cut them out. It's like, you can't help me. Obviously, I have to do it myself. And then all I can accomplish is what I can do on my own.
Well, and one way that I learned this, and this might be the last kind of takeaway for people to take, unless Kari corrects me that I'm wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure I learned it from her, is that
I like that disclaimer. Good job.
That we have a default.
Yeah, totally.
Like maybe after a ton of practice, you could train yourself to have a different default, but you're going to have a default. And to not acknowledge that you have a default survival pattern when you're, faced with accountability or threat or breakdowns, a way you're going to be. Like, I remember a story of a guy who always tried to force everything. And, there was something in the door of the dishwasher, and he just kept pushing harder and harder. And it took somebody else walking over to open the dishwasher and go, there's a fork stuck in it. Or he was at a restaurant in another country, and he just kept saying louder that what he wanted was a ham sandwich. And it was like somebody else said, I don't think they speak English. I don't think you can get loud enough to get this one across. But his default was force.
Yeah.
And he could create a new default, but that's it.
Yeah, a default, I think about default, it's kind of like the setting the system is on, and unless otherwise acted on.
Yes.
So what gets us in this setting? Well, it could be a number of things. It could have been that at one point this actually worked, right? Like,
yes.
All of my strategies for work came out of all, kind of my patterns and habits really came out starting in junior high with group projects, in high school, and then college. It's like, how do I survive these group projects, right? And I became like, one of the things I do is I either take the lead knowing I'm going to do this on my own, or I really strongly avoid being the leader, because they're the ones who are going to have to coordinate and corral everyone. And, I've picked up on these ways of surviving from like middle school.
Yeah. And I would bet most of our listeners got their default grounding from something that was successful, or they wouldn't be something that was worried about their leadership impact.
Yeah, totally. And it probably did work at some point.
Yeah, almost certainly, because you are where you are now. Everything we did worked to a certain point. The question is, does it solve for the future state that we want to go to? And most of the time that answer is no. I
do want to leave people with just seeing what you do may or may not be enough to break out of it. So, seeing that I don't decline projects or requests, that I stay up late, I'm like, yep, yeah, that's me, man. I do that. And then you see, oh yeah, well, I am in a mood of overwhelm and anxiety and guilt. But here's where your ownership can come in. When you see that you made up the assessment that good people get it all done, or you made up the assessment that no one's reliable around here, or you made up the assessment they don't have a clue how much I'm doing. When you can take ownership of making up that assessment, you can see you can pull that thread, right? Like, well, that's one interpretation, that's one conclusion, and that conclusion happens to set me on the path in this pattern. And if I can see that I actually made that conclusion up, valid or invalid, I don't care, but it's not producing effective action from me. And I could actually, rather than relying on this assessment, I could actually instead declare a commitment. What am I committed to in this situation, which will give me a different set of actions and moods and patterns.
So to go all the way back to the example I gave at the beginning of, let's say somebody misses a meeting, or one thing that can happen, we work with, entrepreneurs, and executives that typically make between $300,000 and $2 million a year. So you can imagine they have a lot of inbound that they're dealing with, a lot of life that they're dealing with outside of their sessions with us. And I can notice now my assessments and moods and pattern of like, okay, how do I disrupt this person to have their next meeting with us? Or how can I advise my staff to communicate with them a certain way?
I think that's good.
And instead, that pause you coached us to have of the awareness, okay, about to do that default pattern, revisit the commitment. Like I could look at that specific client and say, you know, if they don't get back to us and get this next stage of their planning handled, it could create this future breakdown for them and their family, which contradicts what they said was important to them over the next 3 years. And then that would allow me to communicate with them totally differently as a steward of our relationship together, as opposed to them feeling like somebody just wants another hour on my calendar, which could happen in the midst of all of the inbound that they're dealing with.
Paul, I'm so glad you gave that example at the end here. You know, one of the really critical things about this accountability series is that we realize that accountability is grounded in the future we're creating together. And so what you just did is you brought that back. You know, what is our relationship in service of this future commitment, of this outcome that we're accomplishing together? And that's why this critical conversation needs to happen. As contrasted with, you know, avoid them, get angry, just schedule another time on the calendar. When we lose that context, when we lose that outcome for ourselves, it's really hard for us to bring accountability into our conversations.
So good. Well, this has been an episode on our default survival patterns and what we can do about them. What are the escape strategies we try to implement by default? And I think today, not only have I taken something away, but I'm sincerely hopeful that this episode, like all of our others, has been a contribution to your leadership impact. Thank you for tuning into Leadership Impact, the podcast for modern executives who are reinventing leadership within their organizations. Subscribe now at Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. And to support you in your leadership impact, we've offered a special course rate to you, our listeners. Just text the word accountability to 555-888 and you'll receive the link. Learn more at grangernetwork.com and join us next week on how to transform your leadership impact with accountability.